You wake up in a castle where your biggest decision is whether to wear the blue silk or the crimson velvet. Your day begins not with an alarm clock, but with servants drawing back heavy curtains to reveal sprawling estates that stretch beyond the horizon. This was the reality for nobles during the early modern period, a world so removed from ordinary life that it might as well have existed on another planet. The nobility lived in what can only be described as a bubble of extraordinary privilege. Their clothing alone could feed an entire village for months. We're talking about gowns embroidered with real gold thread, doublets made from silk that traveled thousands of miles from distant lands, and jewelry that sparkled with gems worth more than most people would see in their entire lifetimes. But here's what's fascinating. These weren't just clothes. They were walking billboards of power, each thread carefully chosen to communicate status, wealth, and untouchable authority. Their days unfolded like elaborate theater productions. Morning might begin with a leisurely hunt through private forests, followed by multi-course feasts that could last for hours. Picture tables groaning under the weight of roasted peacocks, exotic fruits, and wine from the finest vineyards. But here's where it gets really interesting, and a bit disturbing. Some nobles actually employed what were called plate lickers, servants whose job was to clean dishes with their tongues after meals, because letting dogs do it was considered beneath the family's dignity. The cruel irony wasn't lost on everyone, though it was certainly ignored by many. While noble children played with toys crafted from precious metals and learned languages from private tutors, peasant children were already working in fields, their small hands calloused before they could properly write their names. The gap wasn't just about money. It was about fundamental human experiences. A noble child might complain about the temperature of their bathwater, while a peasant child had never experienced a warm bath in their entire life. But power came with its own peculiar burdens. Noble families lived under constant scrutiny, their marriages arranged like business deals, their every move watched and judged by peers who were simultaneously allies and rivals. Many nobles found themselves trapped in golden cages, unable to pursue genuine friendships or authentic love, always wondering who wanted something from them and who actually cared about them as people. The most chilling aspect of noble life wasn't the luxury. It was the casual acceptance of their absolute power over other human beings. A noble could decide the fate of entire families with a word, could demand tribute that left peasants starving, could settle disputes with violence and face no consequences whatsoever. They lived in a world where their desires automatically became other people's obligations, where their comfort was built on foundations of others' suffering. Yet even within this privileged class, there were fractures and fears. Lesser nobles constantly worried about losing favor with more powerful ones. They participated in elaborate court intrigues, where a misplaced word or forgotten courtesy could lead to exile or worse. The very system that elevated them also made them paranoid and isolated. What's truly remarkable is how this system managed to sustain itself for so long, even as the contradictions became more glaring and the resentment from below grew stronger. The nobility had convinced themselves, and tried to convince everyone else, that this arrangement was natural, even divinely ordained. They believed their bloodlines made them inherently superior, their wealth a sign of God's favor, their power a responsibility rather than a privilege. But beneath the silk and ceremony, beneath the feast halls and formal gardens, cracks were already beginning to show. The very excess that defined noble life was creating the conditions for its eventual challenge, as other classes began to question whether accident of birth truly justified such dramatic differences in human experience. Let me paint you a picture of a world so extravagant, it almost seems like fantasy. Imagine walking into a noble's castle during the 16th century, where the very air seems to shimmer with wealth and power. The first thing that would strike you isn't just the opulence, it's how completely disconnected this world was from everything happening beyond those castle walls. The nobility existed in their own universe, one where silk wasn't just clothing, but a second skin. These weren't the simple fabrics we know today. We're talking about silk so fine it felt like liquid in your hands, dyed with colors so vibrant they seemed to glow in candlelight. A single dress could cost more than what a skilled craftsman earned in several years. And here's the thing that really gets me. They didn't just wear these incredible garments once or twice. Noble wardrobes were so vast that some aristocrats never wore the same outfit twice in an entire year. Their feasts were legendary, but not in the way you might imagine from fairy tales. Picture this: tables stretching the length of entire halls, loaded with dishes that seemed designed more to impress than to nourish. Roasted swans served with their feathers still attached, peacocks presented as if they were still alive, and towers of sugar sculptures that took weeks to create and were destroyed in minutes. The waste was staggering, and it was intentional. The point wasn't just to eat well, but to demonstrate that you could afford to throw away more food than most families saw in months. But here's where things get really strange, and honestly a bit disturbing. Some nobles employed what they called plate lickers, actual human beings whose job was to clean the dishes with their tongues after these elaborate meals. Now, you might wonder why they didn't just let the dogs do it, which would seem more natural. But that was exactly the point. Letting dogs clean the plates was considered too undignified for a noble household. Instead, they paid people to do what they wouldn't let animals do. Think about that for a moment. The twisted logic that made human dignity worth less than maintaining aristocratic appearances. The power these nobles wielded was absolute in ways that are hard for us to understand today. When I say absolute, I mean they could literally decide whether people lived or died, whether families stayed together or were torn apart, whether entire communities prospered or starved. A noble's word wasn't just law, it was reality for everyone under their control. They owned not just the land, but in many ways they owned the people who lived on it. This brings us to one of the most heartbreaking contradictions of the era. While noble children played with toys made from actual gold and silver, learning to read with books bound in leather and decorated with precious stones, peasant children were already working dawn to dusk just to help their families survive. It wasn't unusual for a noble child's single toy to be worth more than everything a peasant family owned combined. The cruel mathematics of this system were inescapable. Every luxury the nobility enjoyed was paid for by someone else's labor, someone else's sacrifice, someone else's empty stomach. The silk gowns were woven by workers who could never afford to wear them. The elaborate feasts were prepared by cooks who often went hungry themselves. The golden toys were crafted by artisans whose own children played with sticks and stones. What's particularly striking is how normalized this inequality had become. Nobles didn't see themselves as cruel or unusual. They genuinely believed this was the natural order of things. They had convinced themselves that their elevated position was not just their right, but their burden. They spoke of the responsibilities of leadership while living lives of unprecedented luxury. The isolation of noble life created its own strange problems. Many aristocrats had never spoken to a commoner as an equal, never experienced genuine hardship, never had to make the kind of desperate choices that defined daily life for most people. This disconnect made them simultaneously all-powerful and completely out of touch with the reality of the world they controlled. Yet even within this golden bubble, tensions simmered. Lesser nobles competed viciously with each other, always aware that their position depended on the whims of those above them. Court life was a constant performance, where a single mistake could lead to disgrace or exile. The very system that elevated them also made them paranoid and petty. The tragedy is that this world of extreme privilege was built on a foundation that couldn't last forever. Every excessive feast, every casual display of power, every moment of willful blindness to the suffering around them was adding fuel to fires that would eventually consume the very system that created their golden world. Now let me take you to the other side of that castle wall, to a world where the sun wasn't a gentle morning greeting, but a harsh taskmaster that dictated every moment of your existence. Peasant life in the early modern period wasn't just difficult, it was a daily battle for survival that most of us today couldn't imagine enduring for even a week. Picture waking up before dawn in a single-room cottage that you shared with your entire family, and often your animals too. The smell of smoke, unwashed bodies, and livestock was so constant that you stopped noticing it. Your day began the moment you could see your hand in front of your face, and it wouldn't end until darkness made work impossible. This wasn't a choice. It was the only way to produce enough food to keep your family alive while still meeting the crushing demands of your lord. The taxes and obligations peasants faced were truly absurd. They had to give a portion of everything they produced to their lord, grain, vegetables, livestock, even their time. But it didn't stop there. There were taxes for using the lord's mill to grind grain, taxes for crossing bridges, taxes for getting married, taxes for dying. Some peasants spent up to half their working time laboring on their lord's land for free, a system called corvée labor. Imagine working 2.5 days every week for someone else, just because of where you happened to be born. What made this system particularly cruel was its unpredictability. A lord could decide at any moment to increase taxes or demand additional labor. Peasants lived in constant fear of arbitrary decisions that could push their families from mere poverty into actual starvation. They had no legal recourse, no appeals process, no way to negotiate. The Lord's word was absolute law. The food situation was desperate in ways that are hard to comprehend today. Most peasant families lived on a diet that was barely adequate in good times and insufficient in bad ones. Bread made from whatever grain they could afford, often mixed with sawdust or ground acorns when wheat was too expensive. Porridge made from barley or oats, vegetables from their small gardens when the weather cooperated. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions, if at all. But here's what pushed people to their breaking point. Even when peasants worked harder, even when they sacrificed more, the system kept demanding more from them. By the early 1500s, the pressure had become unbearable. Religious upheaval was spreading across Europe, and new ideas about equality and justice were reaching even the most isolated villages. Then came 1525, a year that changed everything. The German Peasants' War erupted like a volcano that had been building pressure for decades. It started with a simple demand from peasants in the Black Forest region. They wanted the right to catch fish in local streams and gather firewood from forests that had traditionally been common land. Seems reasonable, right? But to the nobles, even this small request was an unacceptable challenge to the established order. What happened next was extraordinary. The rebellion spread like wildfire across German territories. Peasants who had never imagined they could challenge authority suddenly found themselves organizing, creating demands, and taking up arms. They wrote manifestos calling for fair wages, reasonable taxes, and basic human dignity. Some groups even demanded the complete abolition of serfdom, the system that tied peasants to the land like property. The scope of this uprising was massive. We're talking about over 300,000 peasants joining the rebellion across different regions. They captured castles, occupied towns, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the entire social order might collapse. The peasants weren't just angry, they were organized, determined, and desperate enough to risk everything. But the response from the nobility and the church was swift and brutal. They understood that if this rebellion succeeded, it would inspire similar uprisings everywhere. The established powers formed alliances that crossed traditional boundaries. Catholic and Protestant nobles, usually at each other's throats, suddenly found common cause in crushing the peasant revolt. The suppression was horrific. Noble armies, trained and well-equipped, systematically destroyed peasant forces. Entire villages were burned to the ground as examples to others. Leaders of the rebellion were executed in public, often in deliberately cruel ways, designed to terrorize anyone who might consider future resistance. By some estimates, over 100,000 peasants died in the fighting and subsequent reprisals. What's particularly tragic is how the church, which preached about caring for the poor and downtrodden, actively supported the violent suppression of the rebellion. Religious leaders declared that challenging the social order was the same as challenging God himself. They turned spiritual authority into a weapon against the very people they claimed to serve. The immediate aftermath seemed like a complete victory for the established order. The surviving peasants returned to their fields, their taxes, their endless labor. The nobles congratulated themselves on maintaining stability and teaching the lower classes a lesson they wouldn't forget. But something fundamental had changed. The fear of peasant revolt became a permanent feature of noble life. Lords began fortifying their castles not just against foreign enemies, but against their own people. They created networks of informants to watch for signs of unrest. They passed laws making it even easier to punish dissent. More importantly, the peasants themselves had tasted something they'd never experienced before, the possibility that things could be different. Even though this particular rebellion failed, the memory of those months when ordinary people stood up and demanded justice couldn't be erased. The seed of an idea had been planted, that common people deserved better than a life of endless toil and submission. The German Peasants' War became a ghost that haunted the ruling classes for generations. Every time tensions rose, every time harvests failed, every time new taxes were imposed, the nobles remembered 1525. They remembered that underneath the surface of apparent submission, Anger was always simmering, waiting for the right moment to explode again. And the peasants remembered too. They passed down stories of that brief moment when their ancestors had dared to demand dignity, when common people had stood together and shaken the foundations of an unjust world. Those stories would continue to inspire resistance for centuries to come. Here's where our story gets really interesting, because between the golden world of the nobles and the harsh reality of peasant life, something completely new was emerging. Picture a blacksmith's son who discovers he has a talent for creating the finest steel in the region, or a merchant's daughter who can negotiate deals that make her family wealthier than some lords. These weren't nobles by birth, and they weren't peasants bound to the land. They were something the old system never planned for. The artisans and merchants of the early modern period were rewriting the rules of society simply by existing. They had figured out something revolutionary, that skill, intelligence, and hard work could create wealth and influence that rivaled anything the nobility had inherited through bloodlines. And this discovery terrified the established order. Let me tell you about a typical successful merchant family in the 1600s. They might start with a father who began as a simple cloth trader, walking from town to town with a pack on his back. But this man had vision. He noticed that certain fabrics were in high demand in one region while being plentiful in another. He started connecting these markets, and slowly his walking routes became trade networks. His pack became a cart, then multiple carts, then ships crossing seas to bring exotic goods to eager customers. Within a generation, this family might own warehouses in multiple cities, have agents working across different countries, and possess wealth that made them more financially powerful than the local nobility. But here's the fascinating part. They still couldn't sit at the high table. They still had to bow to lords who had less money, less influence, and honestly, less intelligence than they did. The artisans were equally revolutionary in their own way. Master craftsmen weren't just making things, they were innovating, creating products of such quality that they became essential to the very nobles who looked down on them. The finest armor worn by knights was forged by common blacksmiths who had elevated their craft to an art form. The most beautiful tapestries hanging in royal palaces were woven by artisans who would never be invited to see them displayed. What made this situation even more complex was that these merchants and artisans were becoming educated. They could read, write, and calculate better than many nobles. They understood international politics because their businesses depended on it. They spoke multiple languages because trade required it. In many ways, they were more sophisticated and worldly than the aristocrats who claimed to be their social superiors. The tension this created was incredible. Nobles found themselves in the awkward position of desperately needing people they considered beneath them. When a lord needed the finest weapons for his army, he had to humble himself before a master armorer. When he wanted to finance a war or a building project, he had to negotiate with merchants who had the cash he lacked. When he desired the most fashionable clothing, he depended on textile traders who understood global fashion trends better than he did. This dependency bred resentment on both sides. The nobles hated having to rely on commoners, and they expressed this hatred through elaborate social rules designed to keep the merchants and artisans in their place. There were laws about what colors they could wear, what materials they could use in their homes, even how many courses they could serve at dinner parties. The message was clear: you may have money, but you'll never have true status. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some of these merchants and artisans found ways around these restrictions. They started buying their way into nobility. Yes, you heard that right. Titles that had supposedly been sacred markers of divine favor and ancient bloodlines were actually for sale. A successful merchant could purchase a minor lordship, complete with land and peasants, and suddenly transform from a despised commoner into a recognized aristocrat. This practice horrified traditional nobles, but it also revealed the fundamental hypocrisy of the entire system. If noble status could be bought, what made it so special in the first place? These newly wealthy families weren't content to just purchase titles. They often outperformed the old nobility in every measure of success. The cultural impact of this emerging class was profound. They became patrons of the arts, commissioning works that celebrated not just religious themes or noble exploits, but the dignity of commerce and craftsmanship. They funded educational institutions, supported scientific research, and invested in technological innovations that would reshape the world. Perhaps most importantly, they created a new model of success that was based on merit rather than birth. A merchant's son could dream of becoming wealthier than a duke. An artisan's daughter could imagine running a business empire that spanned continents. These weren't just individual success stories. They were proof that the old system wasn't the only way society could be organized. The nobles tried to maintain their superiority through increasingly elaborate ceremonies and social rituals, but the merchants and artisans were quietly building the economic foundations of the modern world. They were creating international banking systems, establishing trade routes that connected distant continents, and developing manufacturing techniques that would eventually lead to the Industrial Revolution. The irony is that while the nobles were obsessing over bloodlines and ancient privileges, the merchants and artisans were actually creating the wealth and infrastructure that would sustain society for centuries to come. They were the ones taking real risks, solving practical problems and adapting to changing circumstances. This tension between old status and new wealth created a fascinating dynamic in daily life. You might see a merchant's wife wearing jewelry that cost more than a minor lord's entire annual income, but she still had to curtsy to him at public events. A master craftsman might live in a house more beautiful than many noble residences, but he couldn't display a coat of arms on his door. The psychological impact of this situation was enormous. These successful merchants and artisans lived in a constant state of contradiction, wealthy but not respected, influential but not acknowledged, essential but not honored. Many of them developed a fierce pride in their achievements, precisely because they had earned everything through their own efforts rather than inheriting it. What's truly remarkable is how this new class managed to change society from within. They couldn't overthrow the system directly, but they could make themselves indispensable to it. They became the financiers of noble ambitions, the suppliers of aristocratic lifestyles, and the engines of economic growth that made the entire social structure possible. The merchants and artisans were writing a new chapter in human history, one where individual merit and economic innovation could challenge the ancient privileges of birth and bloodline. They were proving that talent and determination could create their own form of nobility, one based on achievement rather than ancestry. Did you know that some nobles actually had plate lickers, servants paid to clean their dirty dishes with their tongues? If you're finding this story as fascinating as it is shocking, give this video a like, share it with your friends, and comment below. If you had lived in the early modern period, which social class would you have wanted to be born into? Your answer might surprise you once you hear the rest of this story. Now let's talk about perhaps the most complex and contradictory aspect of early modern society, the lives of women. Because here's the thing that will absolutely blow your mind. A woman's experience could vary so dramatically based on her social class that she might as well have been living in completely different worlds, even in the same town, even on the same street. Picture this scene. In a grand castle, a noble lady sits in her private chambers writing letters to influential politicians, advising her husband on matters of state and making decisions that affect thousands of people. Her opinions carry weight, her intelligence is valued, and her political connections can make or break careers. She wears silk gowns worth more than most people's houses and has servants attending to her every need. Now imagine, just a few miles away, a peasant woman gathering herbs in the forest to treat her sick child's fever. She's using knowledge passed down through generations of women, understanding which plants can reduce pain, which ones can help with childbirth, which ones can treat infections. But in this world of fear and superstition, this same knowledge that makes her invaluable to her community also makes her dangerous in the eyes of authorities. The gap between these two women's experiences reveals something fundamental about how power worked in the early modern period. For noble women, their high birth could sometimes overcome the limitations of their gender. They could influence politics, control vast estates, and even rule kingdoms. Some of the most powerful people in Europe were women, queens, duchesses, and abbesses, who commanded armies and shaped the course of history. But for common women, being female was often a death sentence wrapped in daily humiliation. The same knowledge that made them healers could get them branded as witches. The same independence that made them successful could get them accused of being in league with the devil. It's heartbreaking to think about how many women died simply because they knew how to help people. The witch trials that swept across Europe were particularly cruel to women from lower social classes. Here's what's really disturbing about this. The accusations often targeted women who were too independent, too knowledgeable, or too outspoken. A woman who lived alone, who had medical knowledge, who argued with her neighbors, or who simply made people uncomfortable, could find herself facing charges of witchcraft. The evidence used in these trials was often laughable if it weren't so tragic. A woman might be accused of witchcraft because she owned a cat, because she had a birthmark, or because someone had a nightmare after arguing with her. But the real crime, in most cases, was being a woman without the protection of high social status. What makes this even more tragic is that many of these accused women were actually community healers. They were the ones people turned to when doctors were too expensive or unavailable. They understood herbal medicine, helped with difficult births, and provided comfort during illness. In many ways, they were providing essential healthcare services that saved countless lives. But here's where the story gets really interesting and shows the incredible courage of some women. Even facing these dangers, many women found ways to challenge the system and claim their own power. Take the merchant wives in France, for example. There were strict laws about what different social classes could wear. These weren't just fashion rules. They were legal requirements designed to keep everyone in their proper place. Certain fabrics, colors, and styles were reserved exclusively for nobility. The punishment for violating these laws could be severe: fines, public humiliation, even imprisonment. But some merchant wives decided they weren't going to accept these restrictions. They had money, they had access to beautiful fabrics, and they saw no reason why they should dress like peasants just because they weren't born into noble families. So they started wearing silk, velvet, and other forbidden materials. They adorned themselves with jewelry and accessories that were supposed to be reserved for aristocrats. The authorities were furious. Here were common women, wives of tradesmen, daring to dress like their social superiors. The response was swift and often cruel. Women were arrested in the streets, their expensive clothes literally torn from their bodies in public squares. They were forced to pay enormous fines that could bankrupt their families. Some were paraded through town wearing signs that announced their crime of dressing above their station. But here's what's remarkable. Many of these women kept doing it anyway. They understood that clothing was power, that appearance was a form of communication, and that by dressing like nobles, they were making a statement about their own worth and dignity. They were saying, "We may not have been born into privilege, but we've earned our place in society, and we deserve to be treated with respect." This wasn't just about vanity or showing off. These women were challenging fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy. They were arguing through their actions that a person's value shouldn't be determined by their birth, but by their achievements and character. The merchant women created a fascinating middle ground between the extremes of noble privilege and peasant vulnerability. They had enough wealth to protect themselves from some forms of persecution, but not enough status to be truly safe from social punishment. This put them in a unique position to challenge the system in ways that neither noble women nor peasant women could. Noble women, despite their privilege, were often constrained by the very system that elevated them. They had to be careful not to upset the delicate balance of aristocratic society. Peasant women were too vulnerable to take such risks. They could be accused of witchcraft or worse for much smaller acts of defiance. But merchant women had just enough protection and just enough independence to push boundaries. They could afford to pay fines. They had husbands with enough influence to provide some protection, and they had the confidence that came from their family's success in business. What's particularly fascinating is how these different groups of women sometimes found ways to support each other across class lines. Noble women might quietly protect peasant healers, recognizing the value of their knowledge. Merchant women might employ accused witches as servants, giving them safe places to live. These networks of female solidarity often operated in secret, but they were real and they were powerful. The story of women in the early modern period is ultimately one of incredible resilience and creativity. Despite facing restrictions that seem almost unimaginable today, women found ways to influence politics, run businesses, advance knowledge, and challenge injustice. They did this not through dramatic revolutions, but through countless small acts of courage and defiance. Every peasant woman who continued to practice herbal medicine, despite the risk of being called a witch, was a revolutionary. Every merchant wife who wore silk despite the law was making a political statement. Every noble woman who used her influence to protect other women was challenging the system from within. These women were writing their own stories in a world that tried to write their stories for them. They were proving that gender couldn't contain human ambition, intelligence, or courage. And in doing so, they were laying the groundwork for all the changes that would eventually transform women's lives in the centuries to come. You know, when I think about the early modern period, I can't help but imagine standing at the edge of a cliff, watching an entire world crumble below while a new one rises from the ashes. That's exactly what was happening between the 1500s and 1700s. It was like watching history hold its breath before exhaling into something completely different. Picture this. For centuries, society had worked like a perfectly choreographed dance. Everyone knew their place, their role, their destiny. Nobles were born to rule, peasants were born to serve, and that was simply the way things were. But then something extraordinary began to happen. The music started to change, and people began stepping out of their assigned positions. The merchants and artisans we've been talking about, they weren't just getting rich, they were rewriting the rules of power itself. In cities like Florence, Amsterdam, and London, you had these incredibly wealthy merchant families who could buy and sell some nobles 10 times over. They were building palaces that rivaled royal residences, commissioning art that would outlast empires, and most importantly, they were proving that birth didn't have to determine destiny. But here's where the story gets really fascinating, and a bit tragic too. While these new wealthy classes were climbing the social ladder, the gap between rich and poor was becoming a chasm. Think about it. A successful cloth merchant in Antwerp might own 3 houses and employ dozens of workers, while just outside the city walls, peasants were still living in one-room huts, eating bread made from sawdust when times got tough. The nobles, meanwhile, were caught in this strange limbo. Many of them were actually going broke, trying to keep up appearances. They had these massive estates to maintain, armies of servants to pay, and a lifestyle that demanded constant extravagance. Some smart nobles adapted. They married into merchant families, invested in trade, or even went into business themselves. But others, they clung to their old privileges like passengers on a sinking ship. And then there were the revolts. Oh, the revolts. When people have nothing left to lose, they become dangerous. The German Peasants' War of 1525 wasn't just about taxes or working conditions. It was about human dignity. These weren't mindless riots. They were organized uprisings led by people who had finally realized that maybe, just maybe, God hadn't actually ordained their suffering. The fascinating thing is how the ruling classes responded. They didn't just crush these rebellions with force, though they certainly did that too. They also began to understand that the old system was breaking down. Smart rulers started making concessions, creating new laws, and even revolutionary thought, listening to their subjects' concerns. But perhaps the most profound change was happening in people's minds. For the first time in centuries, ordinary folks were beginning to believe that their lives could be different. A blacksmith's son might become a wealthy merchant. A farmer's daughter might marry into the emerging middle class. The idea that society could change, that progress was possible, that tomorrow might be better than today, these weren't just dreams anymore. They were becoming realities. So, when we ask whether inequality ended or just changed form, well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The rigid class system of medieval times did crumble, but what replaced it was something more complex and, in many ways, more subtle. Wealth became the new nobility. Education became the new birthright. Opportunity became the new inheritance. The world that emerged from this transformation, our world, is still grappling with these same questions. We still have the wealthy and the poor, the powerful and the powerless. But we also have something that medieval peasants could never have imagined, the belief that change is possible, that social mobility exists, that the circumstances of your birth don't have to define the trajectory of your life. The early modern period wasn't just about the end of feudalism or the rise of capitalism. It was about the birth of the modern idea that ordinary people matter, that their voices deserve to be heard, and that society should serve everyone, not just the privileged few. Whether we've lived up to that promise is another story entirely. But the fact that we're still trying, still fighting for equality and justice, proves that those merchants, artisans, and even rebelling peasants from centuries ago achieved something truly revolutionary. They didn't just change how society worked, They changed how we think society should work, and that, my friends, might be the most lasting revolution of all.